It's a rude awakening for President Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency. Data from Stats SA coming in today shows that unemployment has increased to its highest level since the third quarter of 2017, and it now stands at a whopping 27.6% in the first quarter of 2019. The number of the unemployed has also increased by 62,000 in the fourth quarter of 2018. So, is Cyril Ramaphosa the man to tame business and bring about jobs? I welcome both my guests, Professor Adrian Saville, CEO of Cant Asset Managers and Professor at the Gordon Institute of Business Science, as well as Peter Attard-Montalto, Head of Capital Market Research at Intellidex. Gentlemen, I'll start with Peter. Is Cyril Ramaphosa the man to tame business and create about jobs?
Well, that's a complicated question. I mean, first of all, the new president, when he's elected in 2 weeks' time, is going to have to basically get the state in order first, be able to put in place mechanisms for implementing policy, to be generating good policy first and then actually implementing it. That's a big ask. That wasn't evident in the past year. The newly announced Policy Research Service may help with that. It has teeth, political teeth, but that's not clear yet. But really, I think the fundamental question here is, are the right ideas within the ANC? Can they be brought forward into government and implemented to actually get growth? And that's where I'm ultimately skeptical. I think at best we end up with a sort of one step forward, one step back, and growth recovers to 2% and not much more.
Adrian, some say that the African National Congress has had a dearth of ideas when it comes to policy-enhancing mechanisms that it can put into the economy. Fitch is saying that they don't believe that Ramaphosa's mandate is strong enough to bring about qualitative change. What do you say?
I think, Robert, to speak to Peter's point, this is about perhaps getting out of the words and into the action. The ANC is not short on good policy. There's rafts of exceptional policy that have been in place for a very long time. What the evidence that we have, though, is a decade of an economy that has limped sideways, so that per capita income is stalled, unemployment is elevated, share of world export market is falling, which speaks of sagging competitiveness. Which to me is sort of a neat bucket of evidence that suggests we have to get out of talk and into action. And here, the challenge, I think, is to deal with the many components that make up the ANC, because suggesting that the ANC is the government that has been elected and that Ramaphosa will appoint a cabinet, the ANC has many constituencies, and each of those constituencies has an agenda that perhaps challenges or compromises or draws into question specific parts of what would be a clear and unambiguous mandate to get the economy and broader society into a healthier place. So it really is about dealing with those compromises and with the various parties that make for that government.
I believe international investors are waiting for the president to walk the talk when it comes to reducing the public sector wage bill, if you will. Reducing cabinet is only the first step. The second step is even more complicated, which is reducing the extended size of the public sector wage bill, which extends to SOEs. Do you think Ramaphosa has won that discussion with the unions first?
Well, I think we need to be very careful here of not falling into sort of simplistic traps. If you remember, there was a huge amount of campaigning going on and sort of PR and spin with investors through 2006 and 2007, led by Pravin Gordhan, saying, for instance, we only have to pass the mining charter and suddenly everything's okay. And I think investors rapidly realized last year that, actually it matters what you're doing. And the mining charter in that case was not a good document. So we should avoid these sort of simple things like a smaller cabinet. It is a good thing, but it doesn't really help if you don't have the policy implementation ultimately, and you don't have that ability to drive the state through. And that's exactly the same on the public sector. We have a capacity problem, a skills problem, which in the long term is a lot more serious, I think, than the amount of money being spent on it. We should remember that the MTBPS last year and the budget They have squeezed through some more public sector wage bill cuts. But remember, on the flip side of that, with Escom, very specific guarantees were given by the president to unions so there wouldn't be retrenchments after the elections, which I don't think he can really break. So I think we end up in this sort of limping along state on the public sector wage bill.
Adrian, Peter speaks about the education factor here in South Africa, and when you read the stats that some 8 million young South Africans are neither employed or in education or training. So we need an absorption, a large absorption of unskilled workers. Some say we should look towards light manufacturing as well as mining, but both those sectors will depend on Escom. So how important is it that we get that right first? Because right now, we have promises of what will not happen. We don't really know whether, Escom will grow towards becoming kind of like Escom. Why can't we do with Escom what we did with Telkom?
That's a prospect. It's a possibility. South Africa sits with a number of structural constraints. In the case of Escom, it's a constraint that is not just financial and operational, which is where a lot of the commentary is, but I would venture technological too. That South Africa sits with some of the highest photovoltaic radiation in the world, yet we are almost entirely coal-based energy or fossil fuel-based energy. So there's a rather spectacular disconnect between our ability to produce and the resource that we are relying on for that production. Now, you could venture similar observations when it comes to labor, for instance. So it's all good and well, talking about building manufacturing capacity. You need the resources to achieve that. And labor, I would venture, is not the binding constraint when it comes to manufacturing. It's the absence of investment. For South Africa to build that investment pool, we need access to capital markets, starting with domestic capital markets, and then to attract the critical foreign capital that's needed to add not just to the capital pool, but also to the technological capabilities and skills pools.
Peter, how important, or rather where should Cyril Ramaphosa's new government really place growth? Because in South Africa, we have had growth before, but it didn't really yield the jobs. So will growth this time bring about jobs?
Well, that was the problem with growth back between 2000 and 2007, was it was ultimately credit-driven. That added about 1.5 percentage points onto growth during that period. But potential growth was also higher then, around 3%. It's now probably come down to around 2%. But I think this is ultimately the problem around mindset, which we wait to see from government, and is the real test of the president. Is there a mindset of a trust that business, given the right environment, will get on with it, or that actually the government still needs to dictate, and that we live in a developmental state where government dictates? I think coming back to the point that was made just now about renewables, we've seen that very clearly. There's been some very odd little remarks that were made on the campaign trail and a number of press conferences around Escom over the last couple of months, where a deep skepticism of the private sector's involvement in renewables was raised. We've seen further delays to IRP as well. And this is one of those classic areas where if you just allow the private sector to get on with this in a well-regulated environment, you would see Escom reducing to whatever, 30% of output, renewables, and the private sector picking up the rest. So it really speaks to a fundamental mindset problem. And without that, I think growth will only barely come back into positive per capita income territory.
Adrian, the economy is mostly expected to grow by less than 1%. That surely suggests that we are still in for some hard times. And by that, I mean more job losses before we can actually talk about creating jobs. Do you agree?
Yeah, to Peter's point, it's hard to see in the current environment how we move into spectacular growth territory. The investment rate, gross domestic fixed investment, tends to hover around the 16, 17, 18% of GDP level. And what that transfers into is an economic growth rate that is effectively replacement of the existing capital base. And you see then the economy, to borrow Peter's term, limping along at 1 or perhaps 2% economic growth, more or less matching population growth, so that per capita income is stalled. And then to add worry on top of the concern, the growth that happens to materialize, as feeble as it is not job creating. The employment elasticity of growth over the past decade is 0%. So even if you get faster growth, it still doesn't point to absorptive growth, or what we would call good growth, that is broad-based and socially beneficial. So that it really does draw into sharp focus the importance of President Ramaphosa squaring up to the structural issues of the economy and using this as a moment to get economy, industry, government into a concerted effort to redress, I think, the damages of the past decade and get us into a healthy place.
Peter, I imagine that the first moves are always the president's, and that international investors will be looking to see if he can walk the talk or walk the promises that he has made. What are you hoping he does as his most important 3 areas of concern coming into his new administration?
So exactly, people are watching the cabinet restructure, I think, looking for the bad apples to be thrown out. There's obviously going to be some degree of balancing and political, chess going on in the cabinet appointments, which I think everyone is expecting. But really, I think, as I said before, that kind of misses the point. For me, what I'm really watching for is an ability to drive through a credible Escom bailout in the next 6 weeks. This is going to be a crazy time for us. I'm sure we're going to be back talking about this very soon. And that there's a huge number of political red lines that have to be crossed on that to get a credible bailout in place. And then the visa issue. I'm really watching the visa issue, and this is sort of bizarre in a way. It's a small issue in the grand scheme of things, but it really shows where you need the deployment of political capital to sweep away the securocrat interests that exist in the Department of Home Affairs. And so that's really going to speak to the ability of the president actually to, again, move political red lines. So it's little things like that, which I think actually are going to be more telling necessarily than sort of big things like, supposedly big things like cabinet appointments.
Adrian, I'll close off with you in less than 30 seconds. What are local investors looking for?
If I can speak for the local investor, I would venture that one of the critical acts on the part of the president is to hold parties accountable. And that's not other political parties, it's actors in the public and private sector that have been responsible for commercial crimes and corruption. And in the absence of squaring up to those and treating them with the seriousness that they deserve, I think it's hard to expect the necessary confidence. So to me, that's the point of departure, that we need to see clear lines and firm actions taken on that front in both the public and private sector.
Thanks to both my guests, Peter Attad Montalto, Head of Capital Market Research at Intellidex, as well as Professor Adrian Saville, CEO of Canon Asset Managers and a professor at Gibbs.